Hello, dear viewers. Welcome to our final Westminster Development Policy Network virtual seminar. Today, we're very excited and privileged to have Dr. Danielle Resnick from IFPRI. She's a Senior Research Fellow in IFPRI's Development Strategies and Governance Division. She's a political scientist who focuses on the political economy of development. Her research areas include the impacts of public sector reforms on accountability and efficiency, urban governance structures and their influence on service delivery, and foreign aid effectiveness, and more. She has conducted fieldwork in Botswana, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Malawi, Nepal, Senegal, and Zambia. She currently co-leads IFPRI's strategic research on strengthening institutions and governments. She's also the team leader for governance at IFPRI. She has received her Ph.D. in government from Cornell University, and we're very excited that she will cover a very important topic for Uzbekistan, taxing informality, compliance, and policy preferences in urban Zambia. To discuss her topic, we have our own professor, senior lecturer, and Deputy Director on Research, Dr. Kahraman Yusupov, at the end. So with that, Danielle, thank you so much, and floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Bakram. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining today. The topic I'll be presenting on is, as it's presented on the slide here, taxing informality, compliance, and policy preferences in urban Zambia. And this research was funded by the International Growth Center in Zambia, as well as the CGI-AR program on policies, institutions, and markets. And the survey collection data that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes was done in conjunction with our partners, RuralNet Associates, based in Zambia. So let me first give a little bit of background and motivations for why we're looking at tax compliance in the informal sector. And the main reason is that we see a growing amount of literature on individual drivers of tax compliance, but it tends to continue to be disproportionately focused on the formal sector, and there's not much research on this for the informal sector. And we know this is particularly problematic, and we're missing the full view of tax compliance because in developing countries, the informal sector continues to be a major source of employment for much of the labor force. And in the African region, where I concentrate a lot of my research, there is actually a number of tax revenue authorities who have set up some type of program to deal with the informal sector. So the African Tax Administration Forum estimates that about 2/3 of Africa's revenue agencies have some program to address taxation of the informal sector. In addition to national revenue agencies, we know that informal sector workers actually face a range of other types of taxes on their activities by local governments, particularly municipal authorities, non-statutory authorities as well. So warlords, chiefs, vigilantes, cooperatives. So even though we often equate informality with a lack of taxation, in reality, informal workers do face many different types of taxes on their earnings. So these may not be the typical income taxes, but they are necessarily still a tax burden on their livelihoods and the revenue that they earn. This is a particularly relevant issue in Zambia. Some of you may have heard that about 2 weeks ago, Zambia defaulted on its debts. It's been heavily indebted for a number of countries now, and therefore increasing domestic revenue mobilization has been a key policy goal for many years. It's been embedded in the country's current economic stabilization and growth program. So from both an academic and a policy perspective, we felt that tax compliance of the informal sector was a really important topic to gain more evidence and policy leverage on. The main research question for this paper has been, what does the governance setting in which informal sector workers are embedded, what does that imply for their compliance? So as I just mentioned, we see that informal sector workers actually face many different tax burdens from both national revenue authorities, local governments, non-statutory authorities. And each of these authorities are operating with different governance modalities. And so what that means is that we may expect that informal workers may comply with taxation from a national revenue authority for different reasons than they may if it's exerted by a cooperative or by their local government. So there's at least three main hypotheses about what drives compliance when we look at the broader literature out there. Now, one is a basic coercion argument that basically, if governments have strong state capacity, they're able to coerce workers to pay their taxes through strong mechanisms of enforcement. But we know that capacity does not just vary across countries, it can also vary subnationally. So we can see different cities have different capacities to exert revenue, extract revenue than others. And recent research even shows that state capacity can even vary within cities. So we may see, have a very strong concentration of revenue officers in a central business district, for example, but not in some of the poor areas of the city. And we'll see that play out in the Zambian context. A second hypothesis is not that it's necessarily coercion and enforcement that leads to tax compliance, but more that it's this notion of a fiscal exchange. In other words, that citizens are more likely to pay their taxes when they see some benefit in return for their money. And so this kind of oversight and this sense of an exchange and a social contract with the state is what matters for compliance. And then a third hypothesis that is related to the second one is that when you have stronger trust in your government and you have expectations that the state will be impartial, that I'm not just being unfairly taxed and my neighbors aren't, but that the state is equally, taxing all citizens who are supposed to be taxed, you feel more comfortable in paying your taxes and that the state can be trusted with your money. So what I argue in this paper is that the governance setting in which these informal workers are embedded affects the root of accountability. And where you have longer routes of accountability, or in other words, when you have more intermediaries between who's collecting the money and who's providing services, then you're more likely to see coercion being the main driver of compliance, because workers cannot see how their money is effectively being used, because there's just too many points in the relationship between revenue collection and service delivery. And therefore, you need to be using coercion in order to get workers to pay. But by contrast, where you have shorter routes of accountability, meaning that you have fewer intermediaries between the revenue collectors and the service providers, this enables informal workers to have greater oversight over how their money is being used. And in those instances, these latter two hypotheses on reciprocity or fiscal exchange and trust tend to be more likely to drive compliance. So as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at this in Zambia, and it's important to always discuss how we define informality. And throughout this paper, I use the definition that the Central Statistic Office in Zambia uses. And it's effectively employers and business owners who have not registered their enterprises, particularly with the national authority called IFPRI. And they lack contributions to Social Security, as well as they lack entitlements to any type of paid or sick leave. So importantly, that definition doesn't say anything about taxation. They define informality based on a package of whether or not you're getting a certain set of social protection benefits and whether you've registered your business. Okay, so importantly, it's not necessarily really about taxation. In Lusaka, which is the capital of Zambia, based on this definition, about 3/4 of the labor force is working in the informal economy. So it's a huge source of employment in the capital city there. And then, of course, the informal economy is in itself a broad definition. And we're looking specifically at a major subsector of the informal economy, which is retail, informal retail trade. And this is really important, not just for employment, but also for food security of the urban poor. Many of the urban poor source their fruits and vegetables from informal or wet markets in the city. And over the last decade, some other research that we've done has found that the informal sector has been the source of about 4/5 of new broader trade sector jobs in Zambia. So it's a really important subsector of the economy. Marketplaces, particularly informal or wet markets, have been the major source of informal retail trade. And these markets have grown substantially, just from 12 in the 1970s to more than 60 today. And traders within them face a range of operating fees and licenses. These licenses and fees can range from 50 to 900 kwacha per month for a stall. So about the time we did our research, that would have been equivalent to $5 to $90 per month for selling from a stall in these markets. And then all traders need to pay a daily trading fee of 2 kwacha per day, so about 20 US cents. It doesn't seem much, but when you're earning maybe $2 to $3 a day, that's quite a bit of money. And that's particularly if you're selling from on the ground or on a table. So on this screen on the bottom right-hand side, you can see some of the kind of ramshackle, informal tables that people may sell from. And those in particular need to kind of pay this lower daily charge. Those that have bigger stalls would pay these higher fees on a monthly basis. We have two different sets of governance settings for the markets. One are council markets. These are the markets that are overseen by the city council, the Lusaka City Council. And particularly, each market will have a market advisory committee that is led by a market master who's in charge of getting information from the marketeers about service issues and relaying that particularly to the Department of Housing and Social Services within the City Council. The council overall has only 64 revenue agents for the 28 markets that it has authority over in the city, so very few agents. And in terms of services that the council is supposed to provide in response to the money it collects, it's particularly responsible for water, toilets, and waste collection. Though as you can see on the picture from the top right-hand side, it's not always very effective in actually collecting waste in the markets that it has a mandate over. Then we have cooperative markets. These are where basically the marketeers elect their own leaders. And those cooperative leaders, the market chairperson collects revenue and also arranges for service delivery. They also remit payments to the two main utility companies for water and electricity. So this graphic here is basically summarizing those relationships that I just mentioned, showing that on the council markets on the left-hand side of the screen, there is a much longer route of accountability. You have many more intermediaries between the marketeers who will be paying cashiers or revenue agents who are actually accountable to the Department of Finance in the Lusaka City Council. And then on the other side, you have market masters from the market advisory committees who are the ones who are actually providing the services and getting information from marketeers, but they're accountable to the Department of Housing and Social Services in the council. So you have a disconnect in terms of who's collecting the money and who is processing and delivering services. On the right-hand side, you can see that there's a shorter route of accountability or simpler structure in the cooperative markets, where the market committees are the ones that are both collecting the money and providing the services. So in order to look at the impacts of these two types of markets on tax compliance, we did a number of interviews with major policymakers in this sphere, including, of course, the Lusaka City Council, the Ministry of Local Government, which has an effective legal mandate over managing markets in Zambia, the Zambian Revenue Authority, which has been considering rolling out a revamped form of informal sector taxation, and then one of the major marketeers associations called Zanamaka. Then we complemented this with a survey of more than 800 informal workers. We spread that out through a cluster sampling technique across 11 markets in the city. So we used cluster sampling because we wanted to make sure that we were capturing markets that spanned all 7 electoral constituencies in the city, that spanned both markets that are in the central business district. So on this map, the central business district would be almost equivalent to the markets that you're seeing called Kamwala, New Soweto, and Komesa, kind of on the left-hand side of the map. But we wanted to complement that with the markets that are more on the periphery of the city, where you have what are called shanty compounds, or essentially more kind of slum housing, where these neighborhood markets are very important. And as you can see, using this blue and gray shading, we've included both council and cooperative markets so that we can look at the impacts of these governance settings. Now, doing surveys in informal markets is much more difficult than doing a typical household survey where we had very established procedures. For doing surveys in markets, it's a much more difficult setting because, of course, these can be very densely packed. You can have, respondents being overheard by their neighbors. And you also have very gender segregated employment patterns in the markets. And so we had to be very conscious of trying to have gender diversity in the way that we sampled. So what we did is that for each market, we had 3 teams of enumerators. And so one team would be focused on surveying traders out on the kind of sidewalks and pavements and streets right outside the market. The reason for doing that is there you typically have traders selling fresh fruits and vegetables. And these traders are disproportionately, almost entirely women. Then we had another team that surveyed right in the entrance of the market. So that's kind of the 3 and 4, that would be enumerator 3 and 4 on this graphic on your screen. They would be surveying right at the entrance of the market, where in Zambia you have a heavy concentration in second clothing trade. So that tends to be a gender diverse sector of the informal economy. So you'd have both men and women involved in selling secondhand clothing. And then the third team would go further back into the marketplace. This is where you usually have butchers, tailors, those selling live chickens. These tend to be more male-dominated professions in the market. So we did this approach to ensure gender diversity. A vendor was selected every 5th business unit, and the respondents had to at least be 18 years of age. They also had to have worked in the market for at least 6 months because we felt that was quite key for them to understand what is the tax and service delivery setting in the market that they were working in. And after meeting these criteria, we had very low refusal rate, only 19 refusals to participate in the survey. This table here is just to give you confidence that our sample is representative, and it's vis-a-vis the 2014 labor force survey conducted by the Central Statistical Office. So the second column from the left is showing you the data that the CSO provides for those working in the non-agricultural informal economy who are 18 years or older within Lusaka. And you can compare that across the other 3 columns on the right-hand side from our sample. I provide first the full sample of traders, those who are in council markets, and then those who are in cooperative markets. So you can see a few things. One is that there's really no major difference across these key demographic variables for labor force survey versus our own survey. But also notably, there's not much difference between the council markets and the cooperative markets. So you see in terms of age, education, gender, we are seeing relative equivalent profiles. And that's quite important for our subsequent analysis. Something else to highlight is that in terms of being members of a traders association, this is quite low. So for our full sample, only 5% are part of any type of traders association. And this, we'll bring up this point again later in the discussion when we look at implications of tax compliance for collective action. In terms of asking about taxation, this is always a difficult question. There's a lot of social desirability bias. Of course, people don't want to be seem like they're shirking on their responsibility. And so one approach we used was following some work by Adrienne Laval and her colleagues when they looked at this in Nigeria. What we did is you first ask, not are you paying your taxes, but rather, are you requested to make payments to a range of different entities? And the implication is that, of course, if you're, for example, if you're working in a cooperative market, you would not be paying taxes to the council market and vice versa. So by giving respondents a sense that we're just inquiring, which of these entities are asking for payments from you, we're trying to shift the burden from them feeling like they should have been paying taxes, because the implication is that in some circumstances they shouldn't be, because there's no authority from a particular entity over them. So what we asked was, do or does the Lusaka City Council or market cooperative regularly request payments from you due to your activities in this market? And we were focusing particularly on the operating fees and levies that I mentioned earlier. Then those who said that they were requested to make those payments, they were then asked the amounts and the frequency of those payments being requested. Before we asked, are you able to make these payments? And if not, why not? Only those who said they were able to make the payments always are classified as complying in our study. So we're probably being a little bit conservative in who we're saying is complying, because those who said only sometimes or rarely were not classified as complying. But even when we use this stricter definition, we do see that we have a high share of compliance when we look at the aggregate for each of these two markets. So for council markets, we see 81% claim they have to pay the council operating levies and stall fees. And for cooperative markets, it's 74%. So in both cases, we're seeing relatively high rates of compliance. They're not statistically different from each other. But what you may notice from this table is that across the different markets that belong to each of these larger categories, there is quite a bit of variation. And so we kind of took that as indicative that there may be different drivers of compliance going on here. Why do we see such high compliance in a market like Kamwala, 89.6%, and much lower, 57% in John Howard market for the councils. And accordingly, why do we see such variation across the cooperative markets? We wanted to have some greater confidence in how we measure taxation. And so we asked a set of other questions related to tax norms and behaviors. So one was, should citizens always pay taxes? Versus the alternative, which is citizens should only pay taxes if they agree with the government in office. This is quite a common question that's used in some of the global barometer studies like Afrobarometer, Asia Barometer, when they're measuring tax compliance norms. And then we asked another question about whether traders would prefer to go with using a mobile phone payment system instead of paying a physical revenue collector. We asked this because the Zambian government is considering moving to a mobile phone system, because there has been a lot of concerns with corruption and transparency by physical collectors. And what you can see here is that those who claim they paid taxes based on our own assessment that I just mentioned a minute ago are significantly more likely to both say they believe in this norm compliance of citizens should always pay taxes regardless of who's in government. they're also significantly more likely to claim they prefer to go with a mobile phone collector. And we think that we would not be seeing these patterns if our measurement of the self-reported payment of taxes wasn't relatively accurate and representative, because those who don't pay taxes would logically be less concerned about the corruption and lack of transparency in payments from physical collectors, for example. So this gives us a little bit more confidence in our metric of taxation, our dependent variable for the study. Now, for some of our independent variables that I'll show in our empirical analysis in just a minute, we look at distance from the CBD, from the central business district. This is a proxy for that first hypothesis that we had on coercion, because for Zambia and Lusaka in particular, the revenue agents, because there's so few of them, they will disproportionately concentrate on the central business district when going out to collect money. So we felt that in terms of coercion and capacity, this distance from the central business district would be a good proxy for that. We also have a market services index. This captures a range of services that are available in the markets. You know, is there access to toilets? Is there drainage? Is there regular waste collection, etc.? So there's up to 9 different services we asked about. We use this as a proxy for our reciprocity or fiscal exchange hypothesis, because the implication is that where you would have more services, you'd be more likely to pay your taxes because you feel like you're getting some benefit for your money. Then we have 3 different measures on trust. One is, do you trust the Lusaka City Council, the LCC? Do cadres request payments in the market? So cadres are quite unique in Zambia. These are basically vigilantes of the ruling party that extort money from the marketeers. And we felt that where they requested payments, there could be less trust in the council, because there is disgruntlement by marketeers that the council allows these cadres to continue operating in the market. So it's kind of another proxy for trust in the city council. And then we had finally trust in the market chairperson. This was measured by asking who's the first person you would go to if there was a problem in this market. And so the statistics here, the shares are capturing those who said that they would first go to their market chairperson as opposed to any other authority. And then we have a variety of control metrics here. I just point out one key one that's important in the statistical work, which is located inside the market. And this is basically just, you know, are you working inside the market as opposed to being on the street or on the pavements? We thought that was important, and we do see it's important in a minute, because those who are on the street or pavements can, of course, you know, pack up and go when they see authorities coming, or they may not regularly come to the market every day, as opposed to those who are in stalls inside the market. Okay, so this is providing a logistic analysis of likelihood of paying your taxes. It's provided in terms of odds ratios. So, you know, if you're below 1, then you're less likely to comply. If you're above 1, more likely to comply. And I'm just showing here those results that were statistically significant. I'm not including particularly controls that did not prove significant. The main takeaway message from this screen is that distance from the CBD is significant for those in the council sample, but not for those in the cooperative sample. So the further that you are from the CBD, the less likely you are to comply with council taxes. Now, by contrast, the market services index is really key for those in the cooperative sample. So the more market services that you have in your market, if you're a cooperative, the more likely you are to comply. So that's in line with our fiscal exchange hypothesis. And then we also see that trust in the market chairperson. If you have that trust, you see that market chairperson is the first person you go to when there's a problem in the markets. You're more likely to pay your taxes, but this is only true in the cooperative sample again. And then, as I just noted, being inside the market is important across the board, probably not surprisingly for the reasons I just gave, that it's much harder to escape taxation when you're inside the market than if you're outside. This is just a placebo test because you could say, well, was there something particular in terms of how the GPS data was collected, being distance from the CBD? Is that just, you know, an artificial byproduct of the data? And so we took an alternative measure looking at distance from a cemetery, which of course should have no impact on whether you pay your taxes or not, as a placebo test to see if this does have an impact as well on payments in the councils, and it doesn't. So that gives us more confidence that our metric looking at distance from the CBD is actually, you know, capturing something genuine, that it is actually related to tax behavior and not just, you know, an artifact of the GPS data. There's another concern. You may say, well, is it possible that marketeers who are more concerned about market services sort themselves into cooperative markets rather than going into council markets? Those who prefer this kind of direct relationship with the service provider and the revenue collector, do they sort themselves into those markets? So that could, you know, be suggesting there's some latent variable that the marketeers have that we can't observe. And so what we did to try to get a sense of this and to also look at policy preferences is we performed what's called a vote choice experiment. So vote choice experiments create a hypothetical situation where you present different candidates and you only vary one thing about them. And it's that one thing that you're varying that you're trying to test if that makes a difference. So here what we did was we created a hypothetical candidate for the mayor of Lusaka. This was quite appropriate because mayoral elections were coming up, and for the first time, citizens rather than political parties were going to be able to pick who the mayoral candidate could be. So for each of these three candidates, we didn't vary their gender. They're all men. They're all highly educated. They all have either lived or grown up in Lusaka. They know the city well. We only varied their policy platform in the elections. So we said candidate A is more of a law and order candidate. He's about removing street hawkers to improve traffic congestion. Candidate B is focused on the affordability of different stall fees and taxes and improving infrastructure in the market. So this is our informal sector friendly candidate. And then we have a final candidate who's mostly focused on improving the city schools and health clinics. So this is our kind of broad service delivery candidate. So what you can see is almost 58% of our sample, you know, preferred this candidate that's focused on this particular issue of the stall fees and improving market infrastructure. And so we're seeing that there's not really a difference between the council markets and the cooperative markets. So we don't have really this sorting issue. Even those who are in the council markets are saying that this is really a priority for them. So we have less concern that we have a sorting problem. But what this vote choice experiment then led us to consider is, well, why do we have more than 40% of respondents still saying that they would maybe favor the law and order candidate or the broad social services candidate? So is there something related to paying taxes that affects your policy preferences, affects which candidate you would support? And this is really key because a lot of the literature on taxation, particularly the political economy literature, suggests that by paying taxes, citizens increase their demands for representation, and it should make the state more responsive to citizen demands. This basically assumes, though, that individuals paying taxes hold similar policy preferences and that they come together and engage in some type of collective action and tax bargaining with the state. And for the informal sector, we've seen that potentially informal sector associations can do this, but there's really not any exploration of individual level preferences amongst individual informal traders and how taxation affects their policy preferences. And this is quite critical because, as I mentioned earlier, we see a very low share of traders involved in any type of market traders associations. It was only about 5% for our sample. And in the larger literature, collective action by informal sector workers is quite low. So it's important, I think, to be looking at these policy preferences at the individual level as kind of a initial source of evidence about whether these may aggregate up into actual demands for tax concessions by the state. So we're looking at, does paying taxes create greater policy congruence with candidate B, the informal sector friendly candidate, over the others? And so we did a multi-logit analysis, and I'm just presenting it not in table format, but in kind of a rope and ladder diagram on the left based on the relative risk ratios. And so what you can see graphically here is that if you pay your taxes either to the LCC or the cooperative, you are less likely to favor candidate A over candidate B. So you're less likely to favor the law and order candidate over the informal sector candidate. You're also less likely to favor the social services candidate over the informal sector friendly candidate. So paying taxes seems to indicate that your preference for the candidates is very much affected. So even if you are concerned about schools and health clinics in the city, but you're paying your taxes to your cooperative LCC in the markets, you would still prefer the informal sector candidate. On the right-hand side, we present some predicted probabilities where we break it down by the council market and the cooperative market, because the graphic on the left is just for the full sample. So to show what kind of the predicted probabilities from this model would show, we see that paying taxes, you're about 60% likely or 65% likely in the cooperative markets to favor the informal sector candidate. Now, by contrast, if you don't pay your taxes, you are, about 40% or 36% likely to favor the broad social services candidate. So I'm just going to conclude now because I know I'm running out of time. And I'm first concluding with a caveat because the study is on the informal economy, but it's important to remind you that we're particularly focusing just on one subset of the informal economy, which is informal traders. We're not looking at informal construction or the informal segments of the agricultural economy. But it's important to highlight again that many marketeers are already complying with the taxes that are imposed by the city council or the cooperatives, but the drivers of compliance vary by the market type. They are operating in settings of multi-level governance. And so when these tax collectors are more divorced from service provision, compliance is tied more to coercion. When the tax collector is directly responsible for the services, such as in the cooperative markets, the fiscal exchange hypothesis in particular is more relevant. And this highlights that kind of improving compliance in the council markets, it doesn't just depend on hiring more tax collectors, but it could be improved by just highlighting the transparency and oversight in the whole tax collection process. And so, actually implementing mobile tax payments may be one way of addressing physical capacity constraints. Also, clear earmarking of where revenues are going. How much is being reinvested into the markets could be very helpful for increasing traders' confidence and how their money is being used. Finally, a lot of the literature on informal sector taxation is usually discussed as a way to promote formalizing the sector and reducing negative spillovers onto the formal sector. But the vote choice experiment is really showing that tax payments have other benefits. They can be quite consequential for policy preferences, even within the informal sector, and also suggest that even payments to non-statutory actors, such as the cooperative leaders, can affect policy congruence with political leaders who are prioritizing the issues that are most centrally important to informal sector workers. So let me leave it there and turn for any questions or discussion about the work.
Danielle, thank you very much. I find it fascinating. I'll pass it over to Kahraman before we open up for Q&A. In the meantime, I ask our viewers to send their questions through chat box or Q&A function. So Kahraman, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Danielle. First of all, I would like to thank you for this presentation and introducing us to your paper. This is a very topical subject for us. Last year, the government introduced considerable tax cuts, like really drastic, substantial tax cuts. So tax compliance became a primary issue. I mean, if you ask anybody in the fiscal authorities, like the Minister of Finance or the Tax Committee, they will right away say that this is the primary issue that they're concerned with, especially taking it. I mean, considering that large size, I mean, large share of the labor force is not paying taxes. When I say large share, I mean easily more than half of the work-able population is not paying taxes. Okay, so so this is a very topical subject for us. I mean, we've tried to do our own studies, but in our case, I think our informal workers, they're more interested in buying into social safety networks. You know, the incentives are, you know, buying into, you know, this the contributive insurance schemes like pension and, you know, like medical insurance schemes. So we believe that, you know, on the employer side, there's also incentives because, you know, if a business's books are white, I mean, if they're not gray or black, it's easier to get a loan. It's easier to get a loan from a bank. It's easier to, you know, attract foreign partners and, you know, share the business with somebody. So, but this is the methodology that you're using we'll definitely look into it and see if we can apply it for our own studies. But I didn't have much time to get acquainted with all the details because you know, our main discussant had to you know, attend to his meeting on very short notice. But I was wondering if you were concerned with any measurement errors in your survey, like you know, whether the percentage of taxpayers was indeed as you estimated, or did you do any checking procedures, or, you know, maybe checked with labor force surveys or anything like that? Have you done that? That would be my first question. And the second question, I'm not sure if I if I understood you correctly. Did you say that you know, the majority, overwhelming majority of marketeers are women? Did you say that?
Okay.
No, so yeah, so no, a majority who sell fruits and vegetables are women. So not
women. Oh, and then who sell meat?
Right, okay. And then who engage in the secondhand clothing trade are it's relatively equal, male and women.
Okay, so yeah, so my second question is, so I was interested in your sampling design. I mean, did you so obviously you checked whether your sample was representative or not, and you concluded that it was fairly representative, right?
Yes, yes. So that was the aim of presenting you with the labor force survey information. Yes, that in terms of gender, education, age, there's no statistical difference between our survey response and what the CSO finds.
So yeah, so this is my, I mean, this is my second question. I mean, so you didn't find any need to weight anything. So this is just straightforward unweighted regressions, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And so did you do, regarding my first question, did you do any kind of checking procedures for measurement errors, or you believe that this is the share of taxpayers and non-payers are fairly accurate, I mean, unbiased, or, you know, close to actual figures?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. So there is no, you know, there's no data that's, that we have about on the city side, citywide, about, you know, who's actually complying or not. How we try to get a little bit of more confidence in our measurement is, first, there's 2 secondary studies focused on individual markets. One by the University of Zambia, looking at the largest market, Lusaka, New Soweto market. They find about 79% compliance with council revenues. So, you know, we find 81% overall from the councils. And then there's a secondary study, again, commissioned by a local NGO that's focused on some of the cooperative markets, where it's about 70% compliance. And then again, as I was saying, we did some of these secondary questions about norms of tax compliance and preferences to go for a mobile collector instead of a physical collector, just to give us some sense that we would expect taxpayers to, you know, have significantly different views on those 2 things, and we did find that. So in terms of the actual shares, you're right, there still can certainly be some measurement error because there is no citywide data collection on this. But you know, in terms of whether people who say they comply really are complying, we do have some confidence in that because of those secondary questions that we asked.
Okay, thank you very much to our discussant. And Danielle, before we go to the general questions, I also have 2 sort of question comments. So Uzbekistan has gone from very high tax burden to flat taxes. And I still see 2 issues. Perhaps you can comment from your years of research experience in this area. The first one is the relationship between corruption and tax compliance in economies with high share of informality, and the role of tax audits in these markets. And the second one is, you alluded to this. So even if you have flat taxes, people are still not paying taxes because there's still this tax morale persuasion. How would you convince people that paying taxes is good for public service, public provision of services like roads, you know, hospitals and schools, because the money has to come from somewhere. So, so in those 2 areas, what would be your basic policy recommendations to, you know, improve those? Yeah, and then how would you enforce tax collection minus corruption from that relationship? So, thank you.
Yeah, two key 2 key points. I think they're a little bit interrelated, and what I was trying to start talking a little bit about in my conclusion. You know, I think so for the corruption and tax compliance, I mean, we are seeing, at least in the African context, and I'd be curious to know in Central Asia how much this has been attempted as well, but going more towards ICT as a way of collecting. Places like Rwanda, Uganda, they have been trying to use mobile payments for traders. And so essentially it's kind of a top up on when you top up your mobile payments, there'll be a certain amount of tax that's taken out of that, that's remitted to the national revenue agencies. The trick is how you can also do this for local governments that typically have oversight for markets. But yes, I think in terms of the corruption, it's usually kind of digital technologies that are being looked at to do this. Also provides traders with an immediate receipt for their payments, because in our context, traders were complaining that they're told no, they didn't pay for waste. They thought they paid for waste collection, but no, that was just for water. And they have no idea. They don't know what the rules are. So I think, having some type of electronic system with receipts is key. And then relatedly, your second question about convincing people to pay taxes. This goes again to the importance of transparency in the system. And in Zambia, they have signs all over the place about, paying taxes is important for development, et cetera. But it really is, if you don't see any benefit from the money that you're paying, it's discouraging and discourages complying. And so again, that goes to my suggestion about earmarking the money and making that clearly communicated. So by law, actually, the Lusaka City Council is supposed to remit 40% of the money that it collects from its markets. And it collects a lot. I think one of your comments is asking, one of your audience members is asking how much is collected. I mean, it's $3.5 million can be collected, in just a month from all of these council markets, 28 markets. And so they're supposed to remit 40% of that. It's far lower than that when you look at the budget data for the city council. So if they were actually remitting the money and, providing some infographics or other types of dissemination techniques to traders about how the money was being used, I think that would increase confidence amongst traders that their payments make a difference.
I agree with ICT, but that assumes that the tax authority officials have capacity to implement those digital technologies. So I think that will take time. But there are some questions. Perhaps Danielle, you can take them, or I can read them selectively, whichever you prefer. There are some questions. I think.
Right.
Yeah. We have.
Okay.
8 minutes.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so the first one that's there about how important are market taxes for the local state budget. So that's what I was just alluding to. There's substantive. They're 35 million kwacha, or $3.5 million for the Lusaka City Council. In much of Africa, outside property tax rates, these market fees are the main source of revenue raising, not just in Zambia, but many other countries in the region. So they're significant. The second question, let's see. Okay, why do they not become formal? Well, because they would be paying. So I mean, there's many different taxes that are levied in Zambia. So if they were going to become formal, then there's a host of additional taxes that they would need to pay. Often, though, you need to have a significant, significant business operation to want to formalize. And so many of these are family-run businesses. Maybe 3 employees. It can be, a mother with 5 kids who goes to the market every day to sell, some fritters that she made the night before. And so she's not going to go through the bureaucratic hurdles of submitting paperwork to PACRA, in order to formalize, especially if she's not going to be there every day. And also, education rates can be quite low in terms of knowing what the proper procedures are, can also be a deterrent. I'm just going to move, if you see I'm not answering anything effectively, just point that out, Bakram. So I'm just going to try to address at least one question from each audience member. But okay, so one is, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, one is how taxation affects informal workers' livelihoods and their households.
Right. So, you know, these taxes, you know, most people we interviewed, you know, they understand they need to pay something because they're trading on public spaces. So they understand that. There's variations in terms, in our paper, I put the link up to that. We've calculated a little bit what the share is on turnover. So for some, you know, it can be quite significant. It could be, you know, almost 25%, a quarter of their turnover. For larger traders, it can be a much smaller share. So just, you know, maybe 1 or 2% on their turnover. It's really these extortative taxes by the party cadres I mentioned that are very much resented by the traders, because they know that that money is just going into the political party. It's not going to go back for services. Let's see, I see our intermediaries, those who buy from farmers and sell to traders in the markets, are those taxed, and does your sample include such traders? Yes, so the traders, the markets we have, some are wholesale markets. The biggest market, New Soweto market, which has about 17,000 traders, is a major agricultural wholesale market. And there you do have traders who are directly buying from farmers. And then they may be selling to other traders who then go and resell at one of the other markets that were in our sample. So there's a lot of different nodes in the value chain. And so our sample does include such traders, but we did not ask about those types of additional taxes that come along the value chain, right? So there's kind of crop cess taxes that affect some of the agricultural products. You know, there can be different custom levies if they're cross-border agricultural products. So we didn't include those types of taxes. Okay, and then I see there's a link between tax compliance and workers' income level. So we do have in the paper, we have an alternative econometric specification that looks at socioeconomic status and tax compliance. And we didn't find a direct link for the socioeconomic status, which is based on asset ownership. You know, do you own a car, a computer, mobile phone, refrigerator, et cetera? There's an index for that. But we do find, and I don't think this is too surprising, that there is a link between tax compliance and vending from a concrete structure. And the concrete structures would tend to be larger business operations. You know, these would tend to have many more employees working in them. And they're kind of much more on the verge of being formalized than some of the more kind of ramshackle wooden stalls or those selling from pavements and streets. So in terms of the business structure, there's a linkage, but not necessarily from individual socioeconomic status.
Okay, I think that's where we will conclude this presentation. Okay. Danielle, thank you very much again. And we will upload your slides, link to your paper, to this published article on our website, conference.wiut.uz. And I would like to, again, thank Danielle Kahraman for your time and for presenting your research. And I would like to thank our organizers, IFPRI and colleagues from the University of Westminster. This is our final virtual seminar, and every Wednesday we learn. So hopefully we host you and see you in person in Tashkent Uzbekistan sometime next year. So okay. Danielle, with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Good day. Bye-bye.